this lesson we're looking at factoring perfect square trinomials. Now, a perfect square trinomial is one in which our first term is a perfect square and our last term is a perfect square. And we have a middle term which is 2 times the square root of our first term times our last term. And this factors very nicely into our first term plus our second term and that binomial squared. Now, this is a case for a perfect square trinomial where our middle term is negative also. So again, we have our first term and our last term are perfect squares, and our middle term is 2 times the square root of our first term times our last term, but you'll notice here that it is negative, and that factors very nicely into a minus c all squared. Okay, let's take a look at some examples here. In this first example, you'll notice that our first term is a perfect square. Our first term, we can write this as 3x all squared. So the value for a of our first term is 3x. Our last term, 16, this is also a perfect square, and that is 4 squared. And that's our value for c here is 4. Now, if you take those two values, 3x and 4, you'll notice that, yes, indeed, this is 2 times 3x times 4 is 24x. So this is indeed a perfect square trinomial. And we can simply factor that into 3x plus 4 all squared. Now we can expand and FOIL to double check our answer. So let's go ahead and do that. 3x plus 4 times 3x plus 4. And when we FOIL, we get 9x squared plus 12x. Now notice here again we're getting another plus 12x and then plus 16. So when we combine our like terms, our two middle terms, again this is 24x, and we have a 9x squared. 9x squared plus 24x plus 16. So yes, indeed, this is the trinomial that we started with, and our factorization is 3x plus 4 all squared. Let's take a look at another example. In this next example here, just move the screen up. There we are. In this example here, we have a perfect square trinomial, but we have our middle term is negative. So again, our value here for the coefficient of our first term is just 1. So we have x squared. This is our first value. Here, this is a perfect square. This is 6 squared. And now we want to check that, yes, indeed, this is 2 times x times 6. Now here, this will be a negative to give us our positive 36 and our minus 12x. So this does factor nicely into x minus 6 all squared. And again, we can FOIL to double check. X minus 6 times x minus 6, I have to expand that. And our first terms, that gives us x squared minus 6x minus 6x, and here we have minus 6x squared, that gives us plus 36. And when we combine our like terms here, that gives us the negative 12x that we wanted, plus 36, which is the perfect square trinomial that we started with. Okay, we're going to look at one more example here. Sometimes it's a little bit more complicated, and in this case here, in this example, we have 2x cubed minus 28x squared plus 98x. And you'll notice here, this is not in the form of a perfect square trinomial. But what hopefully you also noticed is that each of these terms have something in common. They all have a 2x in common. And so we need to factor that 2x out first. So let's factor that out. When we divide 2x out of here, that leaves us with x squared. Dividing 2x out of here leaves us with negative 14x. And dividing 2x out of here leaves us with plus 49. Now you'll notice that our first term here is a perfect square. Our last term is a perfect square. So here this is just x all squared. This is 7 squared. And this is our value for a and our value for c. And if we take 2 times a times c, that is going to give us 14x. But notice this is negative, so we have to make this one here negative. And negative 7 squared gives us our 49, which we wanted. And 2 times negative 7 times x is negative 14x, which is our middle term. So that means that this factors nicely into 2x times x minus 7 all squared. We can't forget that 2x out there. And again, we could FOIL to double check our answer. I'm going to leave that 2x out there. X minus 7, x minus 7. We have to expand that. So let's FOIL now. That gives us our x squared term minus 7x minus 7x, and this gives us our plus 49. Now we have to keep brackets around that, and we can't forget our 2x out here. And when we combine like terms, these two, that is minus 14x and plus 49. So yes, indeed, this is the trinomial that we started with. And so 2x times x minus 7 all squared is our factorization of that trinomial.